Oh yeah. Good. Hi everyone. Welcome to our I've lost track of how many interviews we've done, but the next in our series of interviews with New York School folks, essentially. We're talking this week with Matthew Holman, who some of you will have met in Paris or elsewhere, who's Associate Lecturer in English at UCL here in London, and also the incoming Terra Foundation for American Art Postdoctoral Fellow at the Courtauld this coming year. He wrote a PhD on Frank O'Hara's curatorial career in 2020, finished that in 2020, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And he is also an art writer and often kind of writing about art and the New York School, and his works appeared in Frieze, in the art newspaper, Apollo and the White Review, among others. So Matthew, welcome. Tell us a little bit. I have, the kind of set of questions that I tend to ask everyone, but I wondered if you might just start by talking us through your forthcoming book, which I guess has kind of arisen out of the PhD, just because I'm thinking back to the famous obituary in which O'Hara is described as also a poet, but for lots of us, Frank O'Hara was also a curator, and we kind of think of him as a poet with this curatorial stuff kind of happening on the side, but it's often something that doesn't really feature that much in the work that we do on him, and I'm guessing that that's maybe a little bit different for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, the also a poet obituary. I think it's museum aide at Modern Art Dies, also a poet, and I suppose that's also one. I mean, we'll maybe talk a little bit later about Ada Calhoun's book, but that's the title of her book, her biography, a memoir about O'Hara. So I suppose there's a couple of things there, one of which is in that obituary, it's New York poet. So that's also largely how we see him. We see him as, the kind of the flaneur on his lunch break, drinking cocktails in the club, like that. That's much of how we see his poetics and his life. And I suppose his curatorial career takes him out of New York, right? He works for the Museum of Modern Art's international program, which was directed by Porter McRae, and this was a really well-funded, well-oiled machine at MoMA, which was looking to promote and kind of expand the horizons of American art. And O'Hara was a curator at that time, and really kind of his role grew, and he was one of the most important MoMA curators by his death in 1966, and was curating retrospectives of, as we kind of know, like David Smith and Robert Motherwell, and curated the first Pollock retrospective. But I think that they're kind of texture for the poems, but they're not necessarily a focus of his life and his career and his work. So that's in some ways what the project is looking to address. So on the one hand, taking him out of New York and finding him in Europe predominantly, and collaborating, working with lots of different artists and gallerists and museum directors in order to exhibit work. And I suppose the other thing which is worth remembering, is that it's a bilateral program. So he was also responsible for bringing work to New York. So there was one particular exhibition, the 1960 New Spanish Painting and Sculpture exhibition, which was a really important moment for the kind of international distribution of Spanish art for these abstract artists who were broadly denied a domestic market and opportunities for the display under Franco. So he actually, his interventions in the curatorial sphere really brought him into Cold War politics in a way which I don't think has really been explored before, and this relationship between how he curates in a kind of an open way, an inclusive way. Much of his personality is invested into his exhibitions, as they were into his poetry. So it's trying to tell that story really, and to understand the poems a little bit better, but to understand this broadly underexplored part of his career.
So lots of the things that you said there kind of sound familiar to me in terms of how he writes. And I was really interested in the quotation that you used in your talk in Paris, where he was thinking about watercolor and thinking about in relation to brevity and wit and freshness and intimacy and the occasional. But what you were just talking about there, you know, collaboration, Europe, bringing art that he liked to a new context, collaborating the idea of art as texture for poems, all of that sounds like his poetry. So I just wondered what you see as the kind of relationship between this curatorial career, which is, as you said, like this is what he's doing, this is what's taking up his time and his life. Like, what is the relationship between that and his poetry, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, he kind of, I think he often curated in a way in which was similar to his attitude to poetry. And I mean, John Yao has written really beautifully on this about how this kind of, at the time in the 50s and 60s, broadly, to be a curator is to kind of, it comes back to Latin, to take care, something which is a custodian, someone who is there to present art in as objective as possible way, to kind of be to be the one that shows this work and to talk about facts and details and provenance and so on. And obviously that sits slightly awkwardly with O'Hara's approach to poetry. And I think that actually in lots of ways he resembles much more the kind of the more modern, the contemporary curator, in which the personality of the curator is very much imbued into an exhibition space in a way that now today you might go and see an exhibition only because you know the curator and you've never heard of the artist. Okay. And so that, I think, is much more of an O'Hara sense of style in relation to curation. I mean, he didn't allow himself to be this kind of objective codifier of art, which is very similar to his poetry style, you know, showing himself nude only with boots in the famous Larry Rivers painting, and that sort of sense that he's a kind of connoisseur of style rather than someone who is there only to mediate kind of facts and details and provenance. But at the same time, he was, that lends itself to an idea that he was doing everything on the wing and that he wasn't really necessarily taking it seriously, and he was very informal. And that actually, when you consider the archival records at MoMA, you look at his letters, he was very diligent. He spent a lot of time thinking through and organizing logistics. And I think that he also, because he was such a good networker of people, he could curate a show of Franz Klein's in Turin, or he could look at a watercolor exhibition in provincial France and work really closely and intimately with those who we would meet and kind of leave a lasting impression on them and see what then would happen. So I think that at a time when American art was in quite a precarious position in lots of ways, or it was an emergent position, they needed someone like O'Hara who was able to champion them in a way which had that exuberance that we receive so often in his poetry.
So a kind of infectious quality.
Yeah.
Whereby, as you said, if you're familiar with the kind of the character of the curator, you can say, okay, well, I can take this work seriously because he says it's good.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that this is obviously as you can imagine, this also posed a problem for him as well as an advantage. So a lot of people, particularly at MoMA, and those who worked in the curatorial capacity but were not in the international program, resented people like O'Hara because they could travel, they had a lot of a big budget in order to present American art overseas, and obviously his closeness to the artists was seen as, to some extent, a problem, as much as part of the reason as to why Porter McRae said he really needed him in the program. So a lot of people, that operates on several levels, right? So I mean, you would have friends who would be frustrated or resentful if he didn't include them in a particular show. You would have other gallerists or curators who were frustrated that actually curation is being determined by friendship rather than necessarily by expertise. And that, but then on the other side, there was the Willem de Kooning exhibition, which was kind of foreclosed only because of O'Hara's death, which de Kooning said he only trusted O'Hara to take that project on. The same with David Smith, the same with Franz Klein. So he's entrusted these big memorial shows of his friends in the 60s. And they say he's the only person that they trust to take the project on. So it's a difficult balance, right? Between, on the one hand, to what extent does he have the expertise on these artists? And we can argue the toss on that, but also his intimacy is what created the conditions for the possibility of those shows. So it works. Friendship is essential, I think, to understanding, as it is with his poetry. Friendship is essential to understanding his curatorial work as well.
But as you said, he was good at his job, right? Like thinking about the archival stuff that you've done and the kind of evidence that you have for the kind of work that he was doing. He was good at his job.
Yeah, I think he was good at his job. I mean, the Gooch biography, you get, a little bit of the idea, perhaps, that he kind of rocks up with a hangover at 11 or 12 and starts drinking cocktails in the early afternoon. And part of that mythology might be true, but nevertheless, he was a very effective administrator. And I think as well, what's interesting when you see things like Jeff Dolvin has written really beautifully about this. When you see some of the archival records as well, you see the doodles which get, or these notes, these, things which he would have probably just tossed in the bin. But you do get actually a sense of a really astute idea of art history in how he is preparing his work. So for example, he's got a doodle and he's thinking about artists that are either abstract or figurative. And obviously this is a time in which the only game in town is abstraction, and the only game in town is this kind of fierce brushstrokes, gestural, abstract expressionism. And actually O'Hara just continued to curate figurative artists, or to actually not really see firm distinctions between the two of them. And a lot of these notes actually, I think, demonstrate a much more astute idea of what was going on in the present. So one of the challenges, of course, for MoMA, originally MoMA was established, Alfred Barr was established, that they would only collect works from 50 years before, to keep it modern, to keep it current, to keep it contemporary. That, of course, fell by the wayside. But O'Hara's task throughout, he was not curating shows of Matisse and Picasso and modernism. He was curating shows of artists who were alive or who were recently deceased. So it's very difficult as a curator to curate shows with which you don't have historical hindsight, and you don't have a sense of understanding the importance of a contemporary artist in the future. So I think that then the ways in which he talked about this in his museum catalogues and his reviews, he sort of talks about it as, and he calls it a living situation, and that's the space. All of this is living art, and the exhibition is the living situation. So he kind of knows the difficulties and the challenges of curating art of the present, but actually looking through the archive, I think he was quite astute and hardworking in terms of how he understood that moment, and wanted to show those artists and promote them through his own eyes, but actually in a way which I think has stood in many ways to the standard of history, I guess.
I really like the idea that he was a very effective administrator. I love the idea of an obituary that says, very effective administrator, also a poet.
Also a poet, yeah. I think you might get, you probably get different. I would imagine he was probably a fun but difficult person to work with. I can imagine that those with whom he worked with maybe had frustrations with some of his style. But yeah, I think that it's untrue to say that this was a casual aspect of his working life. He worked hard on it.
So he doesn't appear to have been kind of winging it, as it were.
No, I don't think so. And actually, he took large parts of it and sort of the political context of his work very seriously.
Yeah.
There's one example of the 1958 traveling exhibition, the new American painting traveling exhibition, with which he was assistant curator to Dorothy Miller. And because he had this close friendship with Motherwell, and because Motherwell was then he was in Spain on his honeymoon with Frankenthaler, and then the Spanish authorities decide in Madrid, of course, we can't have elegy to the Spanish Republic in Madrid. We can't possibly do this. So they decide that they want to change it only to elegy. They want to put it down. And then there's this kind of back and forth between Porter McRae and the Spanish authorities in Madrid. And O'Hara intervenes and he says, hang on a minute, there's no precedent for this. We can't just start changing titles because someone in Madrid has told us to. And then he managed to negotiate everything with Motherwell, who promised to raise hell in Madrid if he changed the name. So he's kind of mediating pragmatically with all of these different interests and all of these different strong personalities in order to resolve this very delicate political situation. So I think that there's hundreds of those kinds of examples in the archive of when he's trying, he kind of very delicately intervenes. He knows who's involved, and he's able to resolve a situation which otherwise could have, caused not a small amount of political controversy, I guess.
So perhaps what your book might do is just ask us to kind of rethink the obviously there's always this sense of the kind of cult of O'Hara's personality, which we get in various different manifestations or presentations in, say, the work of Joe Lasure or Brad Gooch or Andrew Epstein. So it'll be interesting to kind of see these dimensions of his personality kind of talked through a little bit more in this book. Yeah,
hopefully. So I mean, I suppose it's trying to do two things, which I hope are not contradictory, but do two things, which is to say that I think in many ways he looked at his curatorial work as in a very similar way, perhaps, to with that exuberance and brevity and wit, the occasion of the intimacy of that. But on the other hand, I really want to kind of contextualize him within this kind of vexed Cold War moment of him as an administrator within a much larger institution, and seeing him making the kinds of compromises and decisions and coming to terms with the kind of the forces of the global rise of American art through his own exhibitions, I guess. So it's kind of trying to do both, or trying to think both in that way.
How they relate to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
I was interested too in something you mentioned just around the kind of the I guess the practice of curating, which was the notion of care. And so Libby Rifkin has written obviously about care and the poetics of care in relation to Eileen Myles and James Schuyler. It's something that I'm really interested in as well, the kind of the notion of care in New York School poetry. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about how you see O'Hara in this Cold War context, in this kind of massive institutional context, thinking through what it means to care for things, for people, for art, but also about them, and the way in which perhaps he approaches that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have to think a little bit more about that. But that, I mean, is just off the top of my head, I think it's a fantastic question. I mean, one of the aspects of care, and I've mentioned some of these examples of these big retrospectives. I mean, one of the things that you do as a curator is you're working on single artist shows. One of the main things that you need to do is to have a good relationship with the estate, and to work with family members, some of whom are in the art world, some of whom aren't, in order to construct a legacy for these artists, and to think about how will they be remembered, what kinds of narratives about the trajectory of their career will this exhibition maintain or reject or whatever. And again, sort of look at some of his, I think like some of O'Hara's most beautiful letters are often those that with those that we don't necessarily know in the New York School, or not as familiar perhaps, like Elizabeth, who was Franz Klein's widow, and these very beautiful, caring messages that they send to one another about moments that O'Hara wanted, moments of friendship in his relationship with Klein, and how he wanted to kind of delicately gesture to those in the curatorial text, and having that sense of caring for the person who's behind these artworks seemed to be very central. So in the way that curator, in terms of its etymology, might reflect something closer to a kind of custodian, as someone like caring in that way, that is there to protect. And in some ways, O'Hara was approaching these exhibitions in a very similar way: to care, to protect, to champion and safeguard, but in a sort of a slightly different way, one which is actually allowing that friendship, or allowing the personality of the artist to really come through. And you can see that often in So whether it's with Elizabeth Klein or whether it's with Lee Krasner after Pollock's death, held at the Archives of American Art, those are really beautiful, I think, aspects of his care for these memorial retrospectives with those that have been left behind after the artist dies.
Yeah, because one thing that strikes me is that we think of O'Hara as really kind of present in his poetry. When he says, I do this, I do that, we tend to say, well, this is O'Hara doing this and O'Hara doing that. And I wonder about the kind of the nature of curation, and it reminds me a bit of editing as well, as being something from which the curator or the editor is kind of ultimately absent. So you go and see a Pollock exhibition and many of us wouldn't know who had curated it or even necessarily care. You want to go and see Pollock, or you want to go and see de Kooning or Krasner or whoever. And I wondered, is there a sense in which he kind of removes himself from exhibitions, or does he kind of allow himself a kind of presence in a way that's related to or different from the kind of presence that we get in his poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it varies quite a lot. I mean, I think you mentioned there the Pollock retrospective, or when you go and see a Pollock show. I mean, the other kind of great carer or historical carer or custodian of Pollock is Greenberg, right? And Greenberg kind of really takes down O'Hara's style, both as a curator and as a critic, right? Because it's pseudo intellectual, pseudo poetry, and he's thinking particularly about O'Hara's writing on Pollock soon after his death, and when he calls it a great big gigolo of a painting or something like that. And so there's this idea that as writing, curating and writing about artists, as art becomes more abstract, then we need our criticism to be more clear, more codified, more using the language of art criticism as opposed to poetry. And actually, I think that what then happens with the exhibitions is that O'Hara writes in a very poetic way often, but is also wanting to allow himself to, which allows so much of himself and so much of his lyricism to enter into it, and their friendship to enter into it. But on the other hand, he wants to tell, I think, often the whole story of an artist rather than what Greenberg wants. I mean, if Greenberg would have curated a show, I mean, famously didn't really curate, but if he was to curate a show in 58 of Pollock's career, he probably wouldn't have shown anything before 1947, right? So he would have just shown the drip paintings, 1947 to 50. He kind of hated everything before, or not hated, but he lionized that particular moment and kind of reduced what happened before and after. And O'Hara really allowed so much space for Pollock's early figurative works and the black paintings which come in the early 50s. So he really wants to tell a story of Pollock's life and career over the long time, rather than condense it down to something which fitted his own kind of formula. And one thing that he interestingly says about that exhibition, he says that the drama of figurative art is what obsessed Pollock, rather than abstract art, throughout his career. So I mean, to kind of make that kind of claim of the artist which is most famous for abstraction by a long margin, seemed also quite a radical thing to say in 58 and 59 when that exhibition toured. So yeah, his relationship to other kinds of critics who want to make claims on the artist that he cared about, he often put forward his own. He was often very firm about his own sense of that, but that in turn meant that he allowed himself to, or his own perspective on what work was brilliant or not, or what was worth remembering or not, often allowed him to say, actually, I want to talk about the artist's whole career, and I want to expand this out and tell those stories in a much more long form way.
I guess, like, to use the title of David Hurd's book, he was an enthusiast in that sense. And why have just a bit of Pollock when you could have all of it?
Yes, absolutely.
And I really get that. I haven't read it for a long time now, but I really remember getting that sense from the book that he wrote about Pollock, or in his kind of Pollock writings, in which he's so far from Greenberg that it's, to go back to what you were saying earlier, that it's really infectious, and it does kind of convey an enthusiasm for Pollock that goes beyond just the sort of the critical. Or even the poetic. It's so, and I'm interested too in that idea of bringing art to the USA and from Europe, and similarly saying, look, this is really great, and the way in which a curator might kind of rely on that enthusiasm, that sense of, and how to convey that enthusiasm
Definitely,
in order to kind of bring new work to a kind of common understanding.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And I think hopefully, well, my hope is that it helps us understand the poems a little bit better as well. So I mean, many of the travel poems that he writes in Spain, you know, with this kind of trip, 3-month trip in Spain, and he spends a lot of time with Ashbery, that hasn't really been documented. Actually, in the New York Times review of the Brad Couch biography, that was one of the main points which was said, that actually we don't know anything about really what happened with Ashbery and O'Hara, and I've tried to fill in some of the gaps there of this trip that they did in Spain, and all of that trip was about researching the new Spanish painting and sculpture exhibition. But you know, he writes some of his most exuberant, exciting travel poetry during that period. So A Little Travel Diary, Places for Oscar Salvador, and you can see the traces of his curatorial research creeping into many of those poems as well. So I feel as though if we didn't necessarily know which artist he was interested in at that moment, which artist he was having conversations with, and which artist he was looking to exhibit in a traveling exhibition once it goes back to MoMA, then it seems a gap for me in terms of understanding some of those poems as well. So hopefully it can shed some light on the poetry, even though that's not, I suppose, my main objective.
Is there a way to just to go back to that headline of the obituary? Is there a way to kind of rethink the New York School then through some of this? So he's referred to in that as a New York poet. Obviously, the New York School, you know, kind of was a little bit more of a thing at that point, and was certainly more of an art thing. But the idea of him as a New York poet. What you've said here is that a lot of this work takes him out of New York, that some of his best poems are written in Europe or about Europe. And I'm just thinking back to my discussion with Rosa, who suggested that actually if we look at someone like Bunny Lang, B.R. Lang, as a kind of originary figure in the New York School, like Rosa was just kind of offering a different narrative or trajectory on the New York School. I wonder if the idea of O'Hara as being a New York poet, much of whose career is spent out of New York, or significant parts of his career are spent out of New York, like, does that help us kind of rethink or challenge or question that term, the you know, New York School, New York poet? Like, what does this kind of contribute to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Rose is obviously doing really great work in terms of, I suppose, expanding I don't know how quite, I'm not sure if she'd agree with this phrasing, but kind of expanding the canon of the New York School, and looking at kind of women writers that have been excluded predominantly, and you know, broader conversations that we were having. We had so many conversations in Paris about generational thinking as well, and kind of how that the idea of generations is also a problem. So I think that you've got the New York School as a category, and there's so many brilliant scholars coming to bear on that and thinking about, well, how has it excluded writers, or how have we periodized it and understood it chronologically? And I suppose another way maybe to be thinking about that is putting pressure on the New York aspect of
exactly.
And I suppose that's one thing which I'm hoping to do with the book, is that, you know, with a poet like Ashbery, it's very obvious why we might want to put pressure on him as a New York School poet, because he spends the period that we often associate as the high point of that movement in France, obviously. But O'Hara too, who's I think the most New York of the New York School poets in lots of ways, had a really fascinating period in Europe with the international program. I mean, one aspect which hasn't really been Diederik Ustik, who's based at the VU University in Amsterdam, and actually I took a class on with Diederik when I was 19, and this was a kind of a real introduction for me into the New York School. It's called Visual Art and the American Poet. But anyway, on this course, I was introduced to the work of Jan Kramer, and then this becomes a big part of my became a big part of my PhD, was this collaboration that O'Hara makes once he returns back from New York, but after he has this really exciting meeting with Jan Kramer in Amsterdam. And Jan Kramer's he's a kind of a bit of a national hero in lots of ways in the Netherlands, but he's not really known too well outside of it. And this collaboration, which is a kind of failed collaboration, that there's 10 poems and 10 paintings. It's not really completed until after O'Hara's death anyway. But this story is one of O'Hara's, I think, great collaborative moments and great friendships, but we know so little about it up until this moment. So there's so many of these friendships, so many of these collaborations, so many of these travels of him partying with Cy Twombly and asking to be taken up by Fellini's casting director to be in 8½. There's wonderful stories about his life, which is entirely consistent perhaps with how we know him in New York. But actually those networks in Europe, especially, he didn't, apart from serving in the Navy, he didn't travel outside of the US and Europe. But there's so much to say about his travels in Amsterdam, in Berlin, in Madrid, in Barcelona, in Paris, of course, in Stockholm. He traveled widely as a curator, and I think that that part of his life has not really been explored as much as it deserves to be, and that in turn I think opens up for more conversations, as you say, about the other poets and artists of the New York School. I mean, May in Paris had that wonderful piece, didn't she, about the Stedelijk Museum and about Barbara Guest's search for these stairs, her search for Barbara Guest's stairs via the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And I suppose there's a lot of scholars who are thinking, I think, in these terms about the rich lives of these poets and where they traveled and what they experienced and who they met. Which wasn't always, within a pretty small circumference of downtown Manhattan. Yeah,
and that's something that I think. So Yasmin and I are putting together this oral history of the New York School, and it's something certainly that Yasmin's talked to lots of the poets about, that sense of a New York sensibility and the kind of the promise of writing in a particular place in a kind of sort of urban context that's familiar regardless of time period, and yet there's also this kind of aspect of the writing which suggests that you can be a New York School poet, arguably even if you haven't ever been to New York.
I love it.
That it's a kind of, maybe it's a kind of attitude or ethos that isn't kind of dependent upon a sort of urban like a stasis within that particular setting, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. I like that idea very much.
So and there we might sort of just to think, again about kind of expanding the canon, the New York School canon, kind of think about writers who became New York School poets outside of New York. I mean, so one example is Anselm Berrigan, who very much kind of said that he became a poet outside of New York. He obviously he grew up, he spent part of his early life in New York, but he also lived in Chicago and then studied in Buffalo and then lived in San Francisco, and kind of has the legacy, kind of literally in his blood, but at the same time felt very kind of strongly about the fact that he was coming to poetry not in New York, and that was a conscious decision.
I suppose that conscious decision, thinking about that does relate to, as much as we're trying to maybe rethink these categories of generation, does come back to those issues around who, I mean, that quite literally his parents, but kind of maybe resisting or reordering oneself and one's career in relation to the difficulties, the difficulties of being an inheritor of that legacy and sort of having a complicated relationship to it, which in lots of ways is what this Ada Calhoun book, this also a poet memoir biography, seems to be trying to do, of kind of thinking about her relationship to her father, to Peter Shelley, but everything seeming to be mediated by O'Hara and the legacy O'Hara's own legacy with his sister Maureen, and there's lots of complexities here between the dimensions of how we inherit parents and that the challenges of that, but also how we inherit, you know, people that we've taken to be our heroes, and those that we want to look up to, and those that we feel as though we get learning from and guidance from and advice from in a kind of almost parental way through poetry. So I think, yeah, there's a lot to be thinking about.
And of course, her other book that I love is St. Mark's is Dead.
Yeah.
Which is again, just thinking about what you said about inheriting parents and heroes. Like, it's very much about inheriting this crazy street. And the book, yes. I don't know if you read it.
Yes, I have. It's great.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to the dawn of where St. Mark's might possibly have once been.
Yes.
Through to more or less now. And just really thinks through what it means to kind of inherit this myth of a particular street.
Yes.
And how that bumps up against the reality of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that with, St. Mark, there's so many times in this book where it's like, it's not happening here, it's happening in this like old cold water, well, no, not cold water, but like this old walk-up in St. Mark's Place. And there's almost like, on the one hand, it's saying like, times have changed, the world has changed, not everything is happening here in terms of poetic production anymore, and we need to recognize that, but also this kind of clinging onto it as well, that you can't quite get beyond it. And there's that tension always in play with how we all to some extent mythologize St. Mark's and that world, but at the same time also know it to be a myth, know it to be a faith, know it actually probably not to be as half as interesting or glamorous as we
And I guess Alice Notley kind of gets at that in Mysteries of Small Houses, and the way that she sort of reflects on being still in New York, even though she's not been there for 30 years.
Yes.
But of course, not just New York. Her small houses are all over the place.
Yes.
They're in Needles, they're in Essex, they're in Chicago. So it's really good to hear about this project, and that idea of a kind of a curatorial inheritance, and what we might do with going back to thinking about O'Hara as a curator, as an administrator, as a poet, and as you said, how all of those things kind of intersect with each other. Just before we talk about something else, just on the Cold War politics thing, I just wondered if you had if your book kind of thinks about at all the kind of relationship between queerness and the Cold War and the politics of the Cold War, or if that was O'Hara's sexuality something that kind of entered into his negotiations, or the kind of role that he had to play as someone mediating in this environment?
I must admit, it's not. I'm sure his queerness informed, in many ways, all aspects of his life all the time.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something which really came up a lot in terms of his curatorial work. I mean, thinking about his friends who also, Kynaston McShine, for example, another, who's a queer Trinidadian curator, and they had sort of a great friendship, and so there's a lot of kind of good work, I think, happening now on Kynaston McShine. So I think that MoMA was not a, to see MoMA at this time as one, directed under the culture of the kind of patrician Alfred Barr, and more kind of conservative thinkers, politically conservative thinkers, maybe, sort of in terms of the promotion of liberal values overseas, the kind of liberal Cold War program that MoMA's often been accused of. I'm sure it was open secrets for many of these curators ago. But it's something that I maybe need to be thinking a little bit more about, because obviously that's, again, one of the very central ways in which we understand, O'Hara's life and his poetry. but for me, going through the archives, it didn't kind of raise itself.
Yeah.
But I probably need to be thinking a little bit more critically of that in the book.
Yeah, I wonder about it. It's something just I'm just thinking about the kind of the way in which, say, Andy Warhol was treated by comparison with like Rauschenberg and Johns, and also suggestions that, say, I think Charles Alton was kind of less comfortable with O'Hara than he was with Ginsberg because of the kind of different ways in which they moved through the world as queer people. And like you said, it's not always something that seems to be kind of immediately apparent, but I wondered just about the kind of the personal aspect of kind of having to mediate, and whether or not that was something that would have, as you said, it would have, obviously been shaping O'Hara's life, but I wonder the extent to which the people that he's negotiating with or meeting in Amsterdam or Spain might have been conscious of or aware of or indifferent to.
Yeah, possibly. You mentioned there Rauschenberg, and in 1959, O'Hara curates really important exhibition of American art at the Documenta 2 in Kassel, the kind of the big art event, and he wants to curate. Everyone wants to see Pollock, obviously, but he wants to show Rauschenberg's bed. And there was a sense that actually this work, which in many ways is thinking through queer sex, is thinking through the relationship between the intimate spaces in which we have lovers and the exposed and public spaces in which we present artworks. And I think that, at that time, O'Hara writes his poem for Bob Rauschenberg, which is where he sort of explicitly starts thinking about the bed and what that means. And I think this is kind of another example of the ways in which his curatorial work is both informing his poetry, but also at the same time, his personal friendships are allowing him to see a future for American art, which many people at that time weren't able to see. He saw the promise in the bed, and actually the bed then causes this controversy where it wasn't eventually exhibited. And so I think that the proximity between his friendships, his queer relationships, and the works that were being shown also has that other dimension as well, which is not explicit. He's not curating a show of queer art, and I think he'd probably resent that as well. As that would be a kind of a program that he would look to do. But at the same time, there's these gestures of his acknowledgement of the ways in which art and sexuality are so interwoven and are changing, and we're actually moving beyond the dominance of abstract expressionism by 1959. And O'Hara, surprisingly, from what we know about him, is looking to that future as well.
Yeah. I feel like you just pitched like a future book or article, at least, with that. I'm suddenly like, oh, where can we go with this? So I think we did it. I did think this happened with Rosa as well. Like, we can only do so much. So it doesn't. Yeah, I think it's a kind of really interesting, but actually probably quite big dimension of this kind of this work, as you said, on friendships and queerness and relationships and art and poetry, and how O'Hara is kind of thinking about these things and so on. So I've asked lots of people how they came to New York School stuff. How did you come to it? What's your kind of route into this kind of world of art and poetry?
Well, I think in a very sort of glib way, I did know about Frank O'Hara as a teenager growing up, and I was reading Ginsberg and so on as did, and then I did the Erasmus exchange, and I did it in Amsterdam when I was 19, and I did this course. I had to beg Diederik to let me on it. It was actually a master's course, and he was, there's this kind of, visiting exchange student who was sort of very like keen, but like, are you good enough, basically? And he let me do it, and it was called Visual Art and the American Poet, and it was amazing.
Okay.
And and that was interesting because it was broadly about the New York School, but it was often seen from a European perspective. And by that, I mean, for example, this relationship with Kramer, and between O'Hara and Jan Kramer. And loved it, and I just really found my subjects, I think. And then I went back, did my BA at Sheffield, and then I was working with Sam Ladkin on and Sam was a great inspiration to me, and Sam's got a book on O'Hara coming out, I think, this year on kind of the language of art and sort of applying a kind of Renaissance language of art to O'Hara's career, which I think will probably be very much of interest to the network. And then kind of, I left studying for a little bit. I didn't look at the New York School during my master's really. And then I kind of felt working with Mark Ford, I felt that the PhD was about O'Hara abroad, and then the curation kind of became the focus at the end of the PhD. But it was about looking originally at his work abroad. So that's kind of, I suppose, my academic relationship. But there's something that I just sort of fell in love with very early on in this world, and kind of feeling like it was poetry, because as I say, I study poetry. I'm not someone who really wants to spend a lot of time on meter and nuts and bolts and architecture of poetry, and I'm very impressed by those that do. But it just didn't really sit with how I got something from poetry, I guess. And there was this other space which I felt O'Hara really allowed you to enter into, which meant that you could think about poetry and feel it and write it, and you didn't necessarily have to have all of that architecture. So that, I suppose, that's in a bit of a long-winded way around, but it began in Amsterdam in many ways, and then circulated a little bit through what I've done since and into the PhD, but always been something that I've loved outside of studying it, of course, as it is.
So two things there. One is, for you, is that enmeshment of art and poetry something that seems really quite key to the New York School for you? Does that seem to kind of be a really kind of important dimension to it, if you were to try and, if it's possible to do that, kind of encapsulate what New York School writing, New York School poetry is like? Is it for you a kind of fundamental enmeshment between art and writing?
Yeah, for sure it is, and in many ways I've gravitated to the art of that moment as much as the poetry of it. O'Hara obviously famously said, that he really got on well with the painters, because they could say things like, I hate I know just what you mean, I hate Picasso too. There's those kind of moments where actually they're doing something very, very similarly. And for me, I found that really, really exciting. And so in terms of how I think about it, how I teach it, so I've been teaching a course at UCL, and it was called it was Poetry and Painting in New York, and it starts in 1950 and is sort of 4 sections based on a decade, and it begins in that moment. And that was such a joy to teach. I had such wonderful students for that first decade of the 50s, and looking at art criticism, looking at close reading artworks, Joe Mitchell, Willem de Kooning, Elaine de Kooning, and for me, they can't really be distinguished. And I suppose I say that as an O'Hara specialist, right? And I think that, some of the Kenneth Koch specialists, they might see it slightly differently, right? But I think that for me, I have to see it in that way. And actually it makes so much sense to see this in terms of the cultural production of this moment, rather than one which is organized rigorously based on if they're working with a pen or a paintbrush. We'll be chatting to a couple of Kenneth Koch specialists at some point.
We'll ask them, maybe.
So I'm going to ask them that. Are you an Ashbury person then? Does Ashbury's relationship with art interest you as well? Is it, obviously it's really quite different to O'Hara's relationship with art, but is that something that you're kind of interested in?
Yeah, very much. Really interested in Ashbury's art writing and his criticism for art needs. I think it's some of the best. I'm turning a conference paper into hopefully into a journal on Ashbury's relationship with Mitchell, and sort of this, when he writes her work it's called An Expressionist in Paris. Quite a famous piece actually, but he talks about statelessness, or apatry. It talks about statelessness in Mitchell's work, and I'm kind of sort of the ways in which Ashbery was negotiating, I think, his own sense of being someone displaced from lots of things, from family, from friends, from work, in Paris at a time when everything seems to be happening where you've just left. And so that sense of kind of in-betweenness between those expatriate artists who are in Paris, who can't be fully American, certainly won't be French, and his writing on that is something that I want to explore a little bit more. Ashbery, is a true heart for me, absolutely.
That question of statelessness and in-betweenness, it's certainly something that I think about a lot when I'm teaching the tennis Courtauld. It seems to be a really important way into that text, certainly in terms of helping students understand why it can feel so fragmented and so hard to understand, even though you can kind of literally understand it. It's hard to kind of get, and I think there's something to be said there for the kind of statelessness or uprootedness of it.
How do your students take to Ashbery?
I tend to, the kind of preparatory reading tends to alienate lots of them, but the ones who then come to class and have a discussion about it absolutely love it. So it's an interesting one. But I always end the year with a kind of hardcore group of fans who've just gone away and read much more, but have started with the tennis Courtauld just because I love it. Really they find the kind of permissiveness of it once they get to that point, once they're able to say, okay, I can do whatever I want with this. They really like it, and I think the other thing that helps them is finding out, or kind of understanding that Ashbery was really funny and really silly, and he's presented as this kind of grand old man of letters, but actually he was hilarious and quite weird.
Absolutely, and eccentric and loved kids. Absolutely, and I think that's something that students often, and I think I sympathise with them, but students often shy away from humor. That they feel as though when we're learning about literature, we need to take it really seriously. Actually, to talk about humor and wit and silliness can often feel hard to make claims on why it's silly. So I think that a lot of students sometimes get that aspect of the New York school a little bit alienating, and then the ones that really go in for it love it. Charming, but it's not for everyone.
No, but you're right about humor and silliness. So it's something that I had the opportunity to sit in. We had to do some kind of peer review of each other's teaching this year, and I got to sit in on a colleague whose class was on Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle, and one of the things that I love about that book is that there's this really like hilariously weird moments, like the talking cat, for example. I was like, let's talk about this cat who just seems to be like a crucial character, but no one wanted to talk about because it kind of punctures the like scariness or whatever. And we had a good conversation about that, about how it's difficult to talk about humor and silliness from a kind of serious perspective, and certainly that's something that I think people have found with Joe Brainerd's work.
I think that's true. I'm really excited for Daniel Kane's book, for those letters, which I think will be really start to that really operate, I think, on that boundary between being incredibly profound and thinking about what it means to have care and investment in a short life, against the humor, the jokes, the in-jokes, and the relationship between that. I think it would be a fantastic source, I think, to be thinking about humor and silliness, but also why often the most profound moments in our lives are grounded on those things as well.
I'll
explain that really well.
Brainerd's kind of balance of, he's so self-deprecating, yet he's got this kind of tremendous ego that's never really, he's never obnoxious, but he's really that tension that he seems to feel between knowing that he's wonderful and feeling that he's absolutely worthless.
Yeah, I think we all have a version of that.
Yeah. So I mean, that's certainly something that, again, students that I've worked with have enjoyed with brainerd, that he doesn't ask us to think about like the next big thing, which I think is sort of true of Ashbery as well, and it's certainly true of some of the criticism I'm working on. His book April Galleons, and some of the criticism around that was that it didn't contain a long poem. And I think just kind of more widely in research, we're kind of constantly being asked to reach for the next big thing, whereas actually sometimes you just want to be writing about something small and pretty and or funny or weird, because it's it's like got you in some way. But no one wants to fund that kind of project. So
that's a really good point.
So just kind of on that, but maybe not. What are you reading or watching or listening to at the moment? Is there anything that you'd recommend to fellow New York School?
Well, one book which was just finished, which I loved, which will be, I think, will certainly be of interest in New York School group, is the Jack Parlett's recent book,
Fire Island.
Love, Loss, and Liberation, American Paradise. And obviously, if you know, for many of us, Fire Island was this kind of gay-friendly utopia where O'Hara was killed by a beach boogie. But I think Jack's books really kind of gorgeously tells a long form history of that place, and in an often surprising way. So I've just finished that, which
what kind of period does he cover?
It's roughly the 20th century. So it moves back and forth between moments. But yeah, it's broadly the 20th century. And at least the kind of the focus is on how Fire Island, becomes perhaps a utopia in the 50s and 60s, but also then how it kind of comes to terms with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. So it's a story of queer America. It's a story of this place, and it kind of does what a lot of I suppose it's a style, or it's a project based that I think a lot of books are mediating at the moment, kind of like thinking about a particular place and its history, but he's also telling a personal history within that as well, and it interweaves lots of different writers and lots of different poetry particularly, in a way that I'd struggle to say what kind of genre of writing it is, but it's an expansive cultural history of Fire Island, and it's a real joy to read. So I'd recommend Jack's book. I don't know if I'm recommending Calhoun's book yet. I've not yet finished it, so I'm going to finish it. I'm writing a review of it, so I'm kind of coming to finishing it now. I was finishing it hopefully today, but obviously, for those interested in O'Hara, that's a big kind of publication event, and will be certainly interesting, even if depending on how you feel about the book.
Where are you writing? Who are you writing a review for?
It's a small review for the TLS.
Okay, great. Well, I guess we'll keep an eye out.
Keep an eye out for that. Yes, it'll be. I don't know, in the next couple of months, hopefully. Okay. Depending on when this video is published as well. I don't know what else. What are you reading at the moment?
I've just finished reading David Haydew's book Positively 4th Street, which is not a new book, just because my kind of side interest, collage, but also Bob Dylan. Of course, and so I've just been kind of immersed in downtown New York.
Is that one of those? There was these like 4 or 5 huge books on Dylan, right? That came out. Was it last year or the year before? Was it one of those?
No, this is quite an old one. It's from, I think, 2004. So I was having lunch with David in New York last week, so I wanted to have that kind of fresh in my head when I was talking to him, but it came out in 2004, and it's a really interesting one in that it's not just about Dylan, it's about Dylan and Joan Baez and Joan Baez's sister Mimi, and then the writer Richard Farina, and the way in which it's kind of a history of folk music and how folk was sort of superseded by rock in the mid-60s, and Dylan and Joan Baez's kind of role in making that happen. Or so it's a really interesting kind of sort of different, intersecting but different context for that kind of particular part, not just in New York, but there's lots of it, you know, in California and in Paris and in Cambridge as well. But so I'm kind of been thinking about downtown New York from the perspective of these folkies who are very much trying to put literary creation and craft at the forefront of what they were doing.
Right.
So that's and I'm also reading Jerusalem, Jez Butterworth play at the moment, just because I'm going to see that later this week.
Cool.
So, not super New York schooly.
Remind me, who's the lead in it?
It's I can't remember. It's gone out of my head.
Mark Rylance.
Yeah. And Mackenzie Crook as well.
Great. Okay.
So we'll see.
Let me know if you enjoy it.
Yeah, I think it's quite long. There's 2 intervals, which seems excessive. But hey,
there might be a reason. Who knows?
I don't think it's on anymore. But one of the best things I've seen recently was Oklahoma at the Young Vic. This intensely brilliant restaging of the musical. It was just absolutely stunning.
Right.
So, good. Well, in that case, I think we've been chatting probably for about an hour. So thank you so much for talking to us about your book. Does it have a title? Just one final thing. Have you settled on a title, or is it a sort of work in progress?
The short answer is probably no. I think it's going to be called Curator of Modern Life, Frank O'Hara.
Okay, great.
I'm not quite sure. I'm working with the publishers at the moment on the title, but
Okay. So Curator of Modern Life,
I think
by Matthew Holman.
It's probably going to change when it comes out.
It's a good one. It's a good one. Is it a book that you think is kind of primarily for an academic readership, or are you thinking of, you know, similar to Jack's book, kind of the trade academic line?
I hope so. I hope it's going to be useful to academic to scholars, but it's not where I'm it's not really how it's been written, I must admit. I talk a lot about how I'm kind of following O'Hara through these different archives and trying to find little glimpses of him in Castle or in Storrs, Connecticut, through the letters. It's hopefully going to do enough of both, but it's not a strictly academic book, and I'm hoping that people who are kind of interested in O'Hara, and more people are, it seems, will look and see this broadly underexplored part of his life, and see that actually there's a lot there that we can understand him better through.
Yeah, because he's certainly someone who has kind of crossed over himself, in that sense that he is there's a reissue of Meditations in an Emergency out. He's someone who, as we know, has kind of appeared in popular culture in various kinds of ways, in songs and TV shows, in movies. He's certainly someone who is kind of read beyond the academy and kind of endeared beyond the academy. So
definitely, and even in the art, the art world, he's a poet for also the art world today. I mean, the Frieze New York Art Fair had in 2018 had his poems with these kinds of very glamorous New York 50s style art hipsters kind of plastered, as that was their campaign to promote the show. Right. I think that for some reason, a lot of people in the art world, who might not warm or know much about poetry, know about O'Hara, and I think that's going to be one way in which he's going to be reclaimed or re-understood, or brought into our familiarity with him again, and that will be not through his poetry, or will only be more tangentially through his poetry.
Yeah, so back through the art again. Did the research for the book allow you to do lots of traveling? I know you spent a good chunk of time in New York, but were you kind of following archives around different parts of the US and Europe as well?
Yeah, I was. So I mean, I think that's also something else which the book tries to make a claim on, is that kind of I looked at more archives than sort of any direct, collections, I suppose, not necessarily oral interviews, but collections. So yeah, I was in Venice, in Amsterdam, in Kassel, in Berlin, and just sort of looking at finding these little archival notes and treasures, which I think will again shed new light on it. We know, unfortunately, and it's a great shame, and hopefully in the future it will happen, but the letters, of course, are these great, which are in the stores Connecticut, these great letters. Hopefully they'll be published at some point, but we often know those, and we might know details from MoMA perhaps, but the European archives haven't really been consulted, I think, as far as I know, in his work. So that's something else which I'm hoping to be publishing in the book.
Okay, yeah. So it's interesting to think of him as a kind of traveling poet in that sense.
Yeah,
kind of circling back to the idea that if he's not in New York, where is he? And obviously travel in Europe in the way that he did involve not really kind of spending huge amounts of time in any one place. It's Ashbery spending almost a decade in Paris.
And I think that's significant to note for sure. To sort of have like long investments in any of these places. But significant enough, I mean, when he goes to Madrid and has this love affair with Oscar Salvador, and then he has to go back because Salvador's going to be waiting for him again, and there's this kind of real pain and difficulty, and he writes a lot of poetry about that challenge. So he kind of does go back to the same places and goes back to them a different person, has to renew old relationships, obviously spends a lot of time, the most time I think, in Paris, as part of his time in Europe. But yeah, it's something which we need to know more about, I think,
because you can have a really kind of formative interaction with a city or a place, not necessarily a city, even in just the space of a few days.
Sure.
And I think perhaps as people who live in Europe, it's something that we kind of know, in that we do tend to say go to Venice for 4 days and have a really kind of meaningful experience there. It doesn't necessarily need to be I've lived in this city or whatever. That's a different kind of experience, but the kind of traveling through or the short visits can be just as formative as the long stays.
Definitely, absolutely, and sometimes more formative.
Yeah. Anyway, really looking forward to reading it.
Thanks so much, Verona. Thank you.
So we will keep an eye out for it. Do you think maybe next year, the year after, or next year? Okay, cool. Well, just keep us posted. Very much looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Pleasure.
And for sharing all of those insights into the very kind of many possible aspects of OHaras life that we've not quite got to grips with just yet.
Thanks so much, Verona. Cheers. Okay. Take care. Speak soon. Bye.